everyone, welcome to Study Vibes with Ash. तो इस वाले वीडियो में I'll be dealing with MPS 2 जो कि पेपर का नाम क्या है? It is International Relations Theory and Problems. So this is also a theoretical paper. इस वाले में मैंने intro conclusion नहीं दिया है, but I'll be stating wherever possible. Yeah, you can give it on your own. मैंने ज़्यादातर focus body पे जो main part है उसी पर किया हुआ है. So let's start. तो जो पहला कॉन्सेप्ट है दैट इज थियोरेटिकल अप्रोचेस इन इंटरनेशनल रिलेशंस. उसमें तो पहला मेजर पॉइंट इज रियलिज्म एंड नियोरियलिज्म. तो इसके इंट्रो में यू कैन टॉक अबाउट व्हाट इज रियलिज्म. It is one of the enduring theories in IR or international relations. It emphasizes the competitive or conflict-prone nature of the international system. That the main drivers of global politics are power and security concerns. And realists argue that international system is inherently anarchic, meaning that there is no central authority to govern their behavior. So now we are moving on to the key concepts of realism. Isme we are saying what are the key assumptions of what realist theorists or proponents of realism talk about in international theory. First, there is anarchy because there is no central authority. Then there is a state centrism because the states are the main actors and then they are all concerned with what? Their own survival. Then comes power and security because state wants what? Military and strategic power to protect themselves. Then rational actors, that is the state makes calculated decisions based on national interest. It is very rational in its approaches. Then there is also human nature to it because politics of every other nation is actually reflecting their own selfish and power-seeking human tendencies. So realism includes what all things? Anarchy, state centrism, power and security, rational actors, and then human nature. Okay? Then what are the underlying assumptions of realism? First one, anarchy, that there is no global authority to enforce rules. Self-help, that states depend on themselves for security. Rationality, again, states evaluate the cost and benefits, and power-seeking nature, that the states mirror human competitive instincts. Now, who are the major proponents? Thinkers like Hans Morgenthau and Kenneth Walls highlighted how they act as rational actors. Okay. For example, during Cold War, US or Soviet Union may you can see this realist principles because both of them were driven by what? They were driven by their concern over security, and then they were trying to have a global power over each other, and even though there was no conflict. So that is the idea of what that realism stated. Hence, जो example मैंने दिए Cold War between US and Soviet Union, that is a very good example to understand what realism. ठीक है? Now, so for conclusion, what can you say? We can say that realism's emphasis on anarchy, power and security offers a pragmatic and often pessimistic view of international relations. Because what is it arguing? It is arguing that international relations are always conflicted and competitive because states are only looking out for survival. So what is the cornerstone of IR then? It is power and security. But realism was criticized. Okay, and now we have seen the second theory also, that is what are the underlying assumptions. So first one is what is realism? The question is asked. Then even if what are the underlying assumptions are asked, it's the same. You can use the same points. Now for the third aspect, that is realist versus non-realist. So iske intro mein what can we talk about? So we have already seen realism argues about what? That every other state or international relation is driven by what? Power and security. That is the reason. So non-realists are the people of whoever were against realism. They all come under what? Non-realist. So that is basically liberalism, constructivism and all of that. So realism is what? They emphasizes that conflict, power and competition are essential. While liberalism states what? It highlights cooperation and that institutions and interdependence. Okay, you might have difference of opinion, but you all need to work together. For example, organizations like UN, WTO, all of them are working under what? Corporations as well as interdependence. So there you have multiple bodies functioning. Then constructivism, it is focuses on the identities, norms and ideas shaping behavior. That is, IR or international relations are based on these things. So that state behavior is not just for material interests like power or or to maintain the security, but it could also be because of their values or the ideas that they have. Like they interpreted Cold War as a result of the changing norms rather than simple power struggle. It was because, there were certain other aspects as well. One a major example for liberalism is European Union, because that shows what economic interdependence as well as regional cooperation. You can also quote UN. Okay, and for realism, what are the examples? We can quote the Cold War era example between Soviet Union and US, or the competition between US and China, and even the rise of China. That in itself can be explained from realist perspective. Okay. So, next subheading is liberalism or neoliberalism. So, what is liberalism? I've already explained. So, I'm simply moving on to neoliberalism. So, before that, we can start in the intro. You can mention what liberalism is. It talks about interdependence, it talks about cooperation, talks about healthy competitions, all of that. So, obviously, neoliberalism came after liberalism. So, it is something that emerged in 20th century. And it was a reaction again to realism. So, it does share certain ideals with realism. It differs because it also talks about what cooperation and the role of international institutions in mitigating the anarchy. So, what neoliberalism states is that even though there is no central governing authority, the state can still cooperate where in areas of trade, security and environmental protection. And that is the first point, institutional cooperation. For example, IMF, UN, WTO, these are areas where cooperation is possible even though there is no another specific governing body. Then economic interdependence, because they are dependent, because they will understand that trade is facilitated between nations. So if we simply go into a power struggle, it is going to impact negatively, which is why WTO came in, or even European Union. The main reason for forming a European Union was economic benefits. Having such a union to govern within Europe, that helped them to save a lot of cost. Then shared benefits that states can gain mutually through this coordination. You do not fight with each other. And similarly, rule-based order, because institutions always they create a predictable behavior. Okay. Then the next major area is Marxist and radical approaches. So what are the for intro we can say that they focus on what economic systems, class struggles and capitalist dominance, which are the cornerstones of what Marx ideologies. So that is what even Marxists will focus in IA. So they are going to talk about how global capitalism has this exploitative nature. Yeah. So what are the major elements of this? First one is capitalist exploitation, because it is the capitalist dominance. That is, the wealthy capitalist nations will exploit the lesser developed or third nation countries. So that is the idea. That is economic determinism also. Okay. Then imperialism, because it is a capitalist society that expands further, and they will secure more markets and resources, and that will again lead to what? That dominant power will become imperial, almost similar, and then it will become very authoritarian. Then class struggle, obviously global elites exploit the working classes worldwide, and then the best example for that is what the African countries, or even Vietnam War was a result of what? Capitalist imperialism led by US and socialist movements which were supported by USSR and China. Then economic determinism, as I already said, how economic systems shape political structures. So in terms of IA, Marxists basically argue that there is a base structure and then superstructure. So in this case, it is a wealthy capitalist dominance that is creating the base for the capitalist dominance. Then the next aspect is center periphery model or dependency theory. What it states is that these are two critical frameworks again rooted in what Marxist theories, and they analyze the wealthy and poor countries. So who is the wealthy here? The core is the wealthy nations and periphery is the poor nations. So first thing is, who propounded this? It was by Immanuel Wallerstein, the center periphery model, and he divides the world into core, semi-periphery and periphery nations. So core nations are basically economically developed, technologically advanced, and they control the global financial institutions. Basically they are good in all forms. Semi-periphery, quite better than them. Then peripheral nations are the poor ones. Okay. So core versus periphery, that is, wealthy states exploit poorer ones for resources. Then dependency theory was by Andre Gunder Frank, like theorist, who propounded that underdevelopment of these peripheral states is directly because they are dependent on what? Core states for development. If you see in many of the African states, it is these, people from Europe or US who are going and doing uh, these charity works. So they are dependent on them, and that is a dependence theory. Then unequal exchange. What it refers to is periphery is what exporting the raw goods, but they are not able to what produce finished material. So they have to export it back from what these developed nations. The best example for that is Brazil and Argentina. See, they are known for exporting a lot of raw materials, but they're still dependent on what? The global north for technology, capital and finished goods, as well as the oil crisis. That was again an example for the dependency of peripheral nations for energy resources. Then structural inequality. Obviously, because global capitalism will create a permanent hierarchy. It is always the US that is rich, right? There is no way, no matter whatever we try, an African nation becoming that rich at this point of time. So that is the idea of center periphery model, and that is central toward Marxist theory. So for conclusion, we can say they sort of elaborate on how global inequalities exist and how structural factors sort of help in maintaining this dominance of wealthy nations over poor ones. Then radical or neo-radical approaches. So for intro, we can say that again these two are rooted in what? Marxist approaches, but it's not traditional Marxism, as in it's not merely related to class struggle or capitalism. They incorporate elements of what? Colonialism, environmental degradation and the power of multinational corporations. So it gives a more holistic critique of the global system. So it is a combination of what? Radical and neo-radical, Marxism, post-colonialism and environmentalism. Okay, so what are the elements? First is structural inequality, obviously. Global capitalism is inherently produces injustice, that idea. Corporate power. MNCs exploit labor and resources. Then neo-imperialism. It is not, earlier it was like they would hold the government and then they would bring in colonialism. Now it is through economic pressure rather than direct rule. Like we see, how they keep asking trade wars or, saying that if you do this, we'll, revoke these much sanctions against you, all of that. Then environmental critique. Because capitalism is the main cause of ecological destruction. That is one of the, again, major arguments that many of the environmental crisis all around the world is because of what? Because of what these capitalist countries have done. But the brunt is always faced by poorer nation. For example, the workers in sweatshops in developing countries are exploited by MNCs like Nike or Apple, and that is the best example for neo-radical criticism. Also, climate crisis is nothing but all thanks to these developed nations, but it has disproportionately affected the poorer areas of the global south like sub-Saharan Africa or small island developing nations. Okay, so for conclusion, what can we say? That it analyzes the global power structures and it highlights both the exploitation of people as well as the planet. So they want a systemic change. It is not just economic inequalities, there is imperialism involved, there is environmental destruction, and there is a need for social justice as well. Okay, next one is feminist approaches. So this is feminist perspective of IR. Again, this is a challenge to the traditional viewpoint because many of the theories of international relations were men, so their theories have shaped IR. So what they are arguing is that be it realism, liberalism, what else did we see? Constructivism, radicalism, neo-radicalism. Then what else did we see? Yeah, core or periphery models, Marxism, all of them are from the patriarchal view. There is no perspective on women. So they're all gendering global politics. So this is showing how gender inequality has shaped the state behavior as well as IR. Because it becomes IR becomes masculinized. So the focus, like in the first case, what did we see for realism? They were focusing on power and state security and competition. As if these are the only aspects of IR. But IR has many feminine aspects as well. Like what? Inequality, human rights, social justice, or let's say environmental degradation, humanitarian crisis, all of that. So first one is gendered power. Traditional IR ignores women's roles and reinforces masculinity, as what I just said. Masculine, aspects of IR are given more prominence. Then patriarchal structures. The global system itself is privileging male experiences because men are more in these decision making places. So you will see more men in peace building, diplomacy and social movements. At the same time, the role of women are often forgotten, which is why we have UN Women Initiative as well as the Women Peace and Security Agenda, which is feminist human frameworks in the field of IR. Another example is feminist critique of war, wherein war is mostly celebrated, in the traditional IR idea. War is seen as an essential aspect for maintaining one's territorial boundary or sovereignty and all of that. But feminists say that this idea of celebration of war is nothing but gendered. Why? Because you do not see how it affects or the sufferings of women and children affected by war, like in Syria or Democratic Republic of Congo. It is women and children who are always hard hit by war. So for conclusion, we can say that it by giving a feminist perspective, we tend to get a more holistic understanding of the national relations. Otherwise, it is only on one particular aspect. Okay, next is feminist view of the state. So the state is what? Patriarchal. Why? Because state policies always reflect that male dominant power. For example, global war on terror and its impact on women. If you do a study on that, we'll see that the state went for a militarized approach, be it in Iraq or Afghanistan and all of that. Like even US intervention, they were going for war, right? But it affected women in very harsh ways, but that is often marginalized. So it's always the male-centered ideas that get reflected. Then militarized masculinity. Because military actions or war is considered to be masculine, people see them as, dominant traits and something to be celebrated for. The women's exclusion. Obviously, their voices are marginalized. So for conclusion, again, we can talk about that state is acting for, the idea that state is acting for all good when you're essentially forgetting more than half of the population. So the next idea is feminist vision of human rights and nationalism. Again, rights are gendered because traditional human rights framework do not include what? Women's issues. For example, UN Women is an initiative that brought into forefront the idea of gender-based violence as well as lack of political representation of women. And then even in ethnic national movements, you'll see that this critique of nationalism is so centered. That is the second point on masculine nationalism. The national identity is always tied to women. It's always tied to men, because if you see, there are always fathers of the nations, right? You won't find many women, but it's not that they did not exist. They're often forgotten. The best example for that is during the breaking of Yugoslavia. Women were seen as symbols of national purity of victimhood, but their roles in the conflict or what part they played in the reconstruction, those things are not celebrated. It's always, their sufferings that get highlighted, while the victory or the courage of the men get highlighted in the idea of masculine nationalism. Then, symbolic women. Symbolic women is, like I just said, they are merely seen as reproducers of nation rather than political actors. Like their role is to sort of continue the population or something. They're not expected to play a major role. Then another aspect is postmodernism. So postmodernism was again a reaction to all of these theories that came up, especially through modernism. So it emphasizes what? Deconstructing the established truth, and it tries to understand knowledge from a context, and the fact that whatever knowledge that we have, it is contextual, shaped by power dynamics, and it is socially constructed. It is not that the knowledge has constructed a society. It is a society and its aspects which has given rise to knowledge. So the first point under that is there is no objective truth. That whatever knowledge that we have, it is shaped by power. Then discourse shapes reality. It is the language that is shaping the political meaning. For example, even Foucault argued the same thing. It is language and discourse which are the most powerful tools that construct our reality, and they decide on what we think and what we believe. People believe it in the opposite way. People think that ulta samajhte hai, that whatever we think is what we are saying, but it's actually not the truth. Whatever we are being told is what we are actually thinking and saying. The best example for that is Rwandan genocide, because it was portrayed in the international media as something tragic and isolated, and that sort of downplayed the role of Western countries. But that was not the actual truth. Even war on terror, the way international media or it comes into forefront, it's a very positive image. But what actually happens is any kind of violent attack, be it from, no matter what your reasons are, it will always be what there will always be innocent victims to it. Then skepticism of grand narratives. It rejects universal explanations like realism or liberalism. Identity fluidity. State identities are not fixed, they are not natural. It will keep on changing with time. So postmodernism is a critical lens to this, right? Now, what is the postmodernist approach to IA? First is deconstruction. By deconstructing, it will reveal the hidden power behind the political concepts. Then it critiques sovereignty. That sovereignty is nothing but a constructed political tool. Then what is the power in discourse? That power is a consequence of the political language. It is a political language that masks the domination. You might feel that the government is representing you, but in actuality it is overpowering you. Contextual knowledge. That international relations should always be analyzed from the point of view of specific context, because there is fragmentation of truth and deconstruction involved. The best example, another example, is Bosnian War and the role of international community. If you analyze it through a postmodernist lens, we'll see that the discourse around humanitarian intervention was used to justify the military action, while the historical and cultural contexts were forgotten. That is, during Bosnian War, people sort of wanted military action, by giving it the excuse of humanitarian interventions. But the truth is, there is a long history and cultural reasons for whatever was happening. So that context becomes very important. Also, this promotion of democracy ideal that is being put forth by Western powers during Iraq War, that is again, postmodern manipulation. Why? Or something that revealed through analysis from the postmodern lens, because freedom and democracy were used to sort of mask their selfish greeds. There was no need for a war with Iraq for its independence. Then post-colonial theory. Again, as the name suggests, its focus is on to understand the effects of colonialism on global power structures. So it critiques the dominance of Western perspectives. So under this, we have first point as colonial legacy, that it is the colonial power structures that still shape global politics. Then the Western dominance. International institutions still privilege these Western values. UNSC, the permanent five, are still Western nations, mostly, and they are being dominant. Then cultural imperialism. Western norms overshadow indigenous identities. Then the North-South inequality, wherein the former colonies are still economically dependent on the North. Then comes the next theme, that is globalization and global political economy. So till now we have seen all the major theories in IR. I think almost all the theories were dealt with. Now we are moving on to globalization. Okay, so the major points under globalization is, first, it is rising global interconnectedness. So there is a movement of goods, capital, people and ideas that are linkages are happening, and that links the states more closer than ever. It is a consequence of globalization that we have NAFTA, WTO, UN, IMF, all of these bodies. Then driven by trade and technological advancements, communication, transport, reduced tariffs, all of these accelerate global integration. Then economic integration through trade and MNCs. MNCs and global supply chains, they make each economy to be interdependent. Political integration through global institutions. Bodies like UN, WTO, IMF, all of them influence national policies and regulate interactions. Cultural integration plus cultural erosion. Shared global trends spread, but local identities face homogenization pressures. Then it creates wealth, but at the same time it also increases inequality. Then it also challenges the state sovereignty, because there might be known like very powerful non-state actors. Okay, an example for all of these would be Apple's production relies on raw materials from Africa, but it assembles in China and the final sale is in Europe and North America. That is an example for globalization. But at the same time, this has also led to what? Inequality. Not everybody can afford it. Also, state sovereignty, like now Apple is a entity on its own, all of that. Then contemporary international economic relations. So for this, the major points are: global economic relations involve states, MNCs and institutions, and they are the ones who shape trade, finance and development patterns worldwide. Then IMF, World Bank, WTO, they regulate global economic stability. They set the rules, provide loans and manage trade disputes. Bretton Woods system still influences global finance. Post-World War II framework shaped exchange rates and economic cooperation. Right. Bretton Woods was a consequence of World War II, and even now that is what is shaping the international cooperation. It's in major realms. Trade agreements promote liberalization, like NAFTA, CPTPP. They reduce barriers and expand market access. Then MNCs have become the major economic actors. Then economic globalization, which has raised the issues of inequality and sovereignty, because the benefits are often uneven and governments lose some policy freedom. Then we are moving on to liberalization. So what are the assumptions in liberalization? It includes reducing state intervention. That is the core idea of liberalism. The same thing, we are moving on to liberalization. So they favor what? Open markets, private enterprise and free trade. So it assumes that free markets allocate resources efficiently. It encourages FDI, technology transfer and integration. It assumes that markets will self-correct the inequalities, so state need not intervene. Benefits are often skewed towards elites and MNCs. That is one of the major issues. Major example for implementation of liberalization is 1991 economic reforms in India. Then the Washington Consensus. Okay. The next is old versus new world order. So this idea of world order means power dynamics, economic systems and role of IR. Now old world order is the order in which it was during Cold War era, so it was bipolar between US and Soviet Union, the power was balanced. In the new world order, it is unipolarity with US, which has become the dominant power, and then now we are seeing also China, India and EU also gaining influence. So it is multipolar right now. So Old World Order is Cold War bipolarity between US and USSR. New World Order is post-Cold War unipolarity, wherein the US became dominant. Right now it is multipolarity, wherein you have China, India, EU and Russia, which is rising as major global actors. Now the power is distributed among states and institutions. So it is not just military blocs right now, even institutions, even UN has certain power. Okay. Next is global corporatism and sovereignty. Global corporatism is the dominance of MNCs in global economy. That is, corporations increasingly shape global trade and national policies. Now, MNCs have economic power rivaling states, and many corporations generate revenues larger than national GDPs, and this weakens the state sovereignty. Governments adjust laws to attract investment or avoid corporate pressure, and that leads to race to the bottom. Countries lower taxes and regulations to remain competitive. Corporate influence shapes major trade agreements, and investment clauses often allow corporations to challenge the state laws. Then regional economic groupings like EU, SAARC, ASEAN or Mercosur and any of them. So what is the advantage of these groupings? They enable regional integration and cooperation. They can coordinate on trade, security and development. Then it reduces intra-regional trade barriers because there is no need for separate permissions, and that will also boost the markets. Then enhance collective bargaining, because the entire grouping is seen as a unified block. So you have more number and you have more representation. Then it promotes political stability and conflict reduction. Why? Because whatever issues they have, they can discuss and reduce them. Okay. I hope you know what each of these groupings are. If there is time, then I will explain each of them separately. So what is the main idea? It is for cooperation and peaceful coexistence. Okay. Next one is global indicators of inequality. So inequality is measured between and within countries because wealth varies as well as opportunities. Gini coefficient measures income distribution. So higher values of Gini coefficient shows greater inequality. Then HDI is a sign of what? Well-being. How on factors like education, life expectancy and income, how much has the population benefited. Then global inequality persists despite growth. That is, rich states and elites, even though they are the ones who get most gains, the rest of it, they sort of suffer. Top 1% wealth shares highlight concentration. That is only the 1%, that is a small elite who are getting the greatest of the wealth. The best example is Western Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa. That is an example of global inequality. Even though there has been substantial growth in China and India, you can still see inequality within regions. So that shows that wealth is still getting concentrated with very few. Then FDI versus portfolio investment. So what is FDI? FDI is long-term investments with control. That is, they will establish factories or subsidiaries in host countries. They'll stay here for longer time. Both of them are cross-border financial flows, but there are differences, and that is what I am trying to explain. Portfolio investment is actually short-term financial flows. That is, investor will not establish factory or subsidiaries, rather they'll just buy stocks, bonds or securities. So in this case, they do not exert any control. But when you have an institution here, they have more control. So FDI is the one that stabilizes economies because that will bring in technology, jobs and expertise. More opportunities. Portfolio flows are quite volatile because let's say if the stock market crash happens, then the investment will exit the market and that will lead to financial instability. What is the key difference? Control versus liquidity. Portfolio investments are always liquid, like you can always sell your shares or bonds or securities and get money. But FDI is more about ownership. It's not about getting rid of the resource, but you sort of become the owner and then you will have more control. Okay, so let me just wind up with this particular video. उसके बाद अभी जल्दी I'll be uploading the other parts. So stay tuned and thanks for watching. Do like, share and subscribe the channel. ऐसे कई सारे वीडियोस भी आएंगे और आगे की जो वीडियोस है I'll try to send them much earlier ताकि आपको और बेहतर यूज़ हो. अभी भी these answers are quite good, so just go through them for your exam. So do like, share and subscribe and put down your comments as well. Thank you.